Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Charity Village webinar. We will just take a moment for everyone to join the session. Okay, we will get started. Welcome to today's Charity Village webinar. My name is Mercedes, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Specialist of Charity Village. As we are gathering here in a virtual platform, it is important to acknowledge that each of us is joining this webinar from the ancestral or unceded lands of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people. As a settler on this land, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, which includes the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation. For those who may be joining a Charity Village webinar for the first time, Charity Village is Canada's largest online job board for the nonprofit sector. In addition to our online job board, organizations can also post volunteer positions. So if you are looking for work or to recruit talent in the sector, Charity Village is a great place to start. We also have a ton of excellent resources for nonprofit professionals, including online courses, articles, fundraising tools, and free webinars like the one we are presenting today. Before we start today's webinar, I would like to quickly run through some housekeeping items. You may have noticed when you joined the webinar that you were automatically put on mute. Since we have hundreds of participants in today's session, it is important for us to minimize the amount of background noise so that everyone can clearly hear the presentation. But you can still ask questions and make comments using the question box at the bottom of the Zoom control panel. Look for that at the bottom of your screen. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please submit your questions as you think of them, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. You can also mail your questions to webinars@charityvillage.com. If you happen to encounter any technical issues with the webinar, whether viewing the presentation or with the audio, please let us know in the question box or by sending us an email. We will do our best to get any technical difficulties resolved as quickly as possible, but in a worst case scenario, please remember that we are recording today's webinar and we will send you the full recording by email tomorrow. So if you get called away or disconnected, you will still be able to view the full presentation. And with that, I'd like to welcome our presenters for today, Rochelle Greaves and Roxanne Tacky, co-founders of StoryPoint Consulting.
Thanks so much, Mercedes. We're really happy to welcome everyone to our session this afternoon, Fundraising 101, encouraging active board participation and leadership. And we're really pleased to be with you here today. Just to give you a quick background about us, Roxanne and I are sisters, and we work primarily with small grassroots nonprofits, those who are new to the nonprofit sector, or experienced professionals who are looking for fundraising training. And our approach to fundraising is simple and practical, and we really strive to create solutions for organizations that are not only within their capacity, but that they can implement immediately.
And before we start with the formal part of the session today, we would just first like to acknowledge the land that we're on. So I am located in Manitoba. I'm currently sitting on Treaty 1 land. Rochelle's in Southern Ontario, and the land she's sitting on is covered by the Williams Treaties. And we acknowledge and celebrate Indigenous communities in Canada that have a rich history of contributions to Canadian society and still continue to contribute their gifts and talents. And as Black Canadians whose ancestors were not the purveyors of colonialism, we still acknowledge that we benefit from colonialism and have an honest desire to work in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration.
So before we get started, we'd like to do a quick survey to get a feel for who's in the room. So let me just quickly launch that. And we just wanted to know, is your board engaged with your organization's fundraising efforts? So the possible answers are yes, heavily involved, somewhat involved, or no, not at all. So I'll just give you a moment to respond and we'll share the results. Okay, so we can see here that we have quite a few people who their board is actually quite involved. I think what will happen today is that there will be a lot of organizations where their board, they would like them to take an active role, but I think everyone here will get a lot out of today's session. So on to our outline. Today, we're going to talk about what we mean by fundraising and what the board's role should be. Then we're going to talk about common reasons that board members are not as fully engaged in their organization's fundraising. Then we'll discuss helpful strategies for getting board members to take a more active role in fundraising. And finally, we'll end with some practical tips that you can put into practice right away to have your current board members involved in your fundraising. Often when we think of fundraising, we think of tasks that aren't very fun. We think of activities like asking people for money, trying to sell things to people they don't really want, or maybe even seeking out wealthy donors to support your underfunded cause. But we're going to present something different today. We love this quote from Henry Rousseau that states, "Fundraising is the gentle art of teaching the joy of giving." Many of us think that we're burdening others or we're bothering people by asking for a donation. But if your organization can do a great job communicating the importance of your cause, you can really help the general public get excited about something that matches their values. They'll feel great about supporting your cause and helping you accomplish your goal, all because you gave them an opportunity to support something that they value. Now, if I were to ask you, what value does your cause provide the community? What would you say? For example, if your organization supports sport and recreation, and I asked, what is the value or the benefits of the cause to the community? You'd likely give me answers like, sport and recreation creates strong communities, it builds relationships, and it creates healthier, happier, and safer communities. And I could go on. No matter what cause your organization supports, your work is not possible without sustainable funding. And I'm sure we'd all advocate for the government to provide more funds to support the nonprofit sector. However, another way to ensure a strong and sustainable sector is to raise funds from the community. Your job as professionals in the sector is to be able to effectively communicate the benefits of your work to others and to get them as excited about the cause as you are. So then the work of fundraising becomes less about asking for funds and more about communicating the benefits of your organization. So let's start by dispelling some common myths about fundraising. The first myth is that fundraising is just about giving money. People give in many different ways, and we shouldn't discount the power of various forms of generosity. And we would advocate that all the countless ways that people contribute to your organization can all be considered fundraising. Secondly, that fundraising is a complicated process. Fundraising isn't a complicated mystery, but it does take planning and consistency. The next myth is that corporations give the most money, which isn't true. Research tells us that individuals are more generous than corporations. And finally, people will give automatically once they see and understand your value in the community. Well, although it's important to share the value of your cause, as we discussed earlier, generally, many people still need to be asked before they give. Now, most organizations we work with are small shops, which is probably relatable for many of you. And what we mean by a small shop is an organization that has minimal or even no staff and has volunteers who put in a significant amount of work. But whether or not your organization has a small team, It's really important that everyone participates in fundraising and that everyone is aware of what their role is so your team can be most effective. So the question we need to answer is, who is responsible for fundraising at our organization? And the answer is everyone. An organization's board of directors, staff, and volunteers all play an important role in generating revenue for the organization.
So sometimes organizations might bring in an external fundraising help. So for example, consultants. And although that can really enhance your fundraising capacity, it's also important to have an internal team who's setting the strategy and monitoring your organization's fundraising plan. So depending on the size of your organization and your specific needs, you may have a mix of staff and volunteers or board members on a fundraising committee, or at least people who have fundraising as part of their portfolio to ensure your organization's goals are met. Now, the board has a particularly important role of ensuring that your organization adheres to its mission and ensuring your organization's long-term financial stability. And in fact, one of the board's most important responsibilities is figuring out how your organization will be funded and participating in that funding. The idea of the board being responsible for fundraising can be a bit of a hot topic because the board does have the power to delegate some of this responsibility for fundraising to other volunteers or to staff. So sometimes the lines of who's responsible can get a bit fuzzy. So we're going to look specifically at some of the basic functions a board should fulfill in regards to fundraising. Firstly, as we mentioned, the board is responsible for ensuring that your organization can meet the needs of the community that you serve well into the future. That means part of the strategic vision that the board sets should include planning for how your organization will maintain its financial health and longevity into the future. So that may include, for example, planning for a reserve fund that your organization can rely on in times of uncertainty. Also, a board should demonstrate its commitment to fundraising through ensuring that there is a fundraising budget. Organizations that have resources to support their fundraising efforts will be more successful at fundraising than organizations without a dedicated fundraising budget. The fundraising budget might include resources like dedicated fundraising staff or a budget for fundraising software to keep the fundraising targets on track, or even money set aside to bring on extra resources, such as a fundraising consultant or perhaps contract employees. Next is process. So that simply means if someone was to tell one of your board members that they would like to make a donation to your organization, would your board member know how to direct them? Do they understand the basic administrative process of how your organization handles donations? Do they know whether or not you can offer a tax receipt? So while volunteer board members really should not be expected to understand all of the basics of how your organization runs, they should be able to help direct donations to the right place. And finally, individual board members should be expected to follow through on their commitments. If a board member commits to carrying out basic tasks as it relates to fundraising, they must be dependable and accountable for your organization's fundraising efforts to be successful. And plus, this is an area where frustration can really develop because when people don't fulfill their commitments, it can really have a negative impact on the relationships between staff and board members, or even between board members. So it's so important for board members to be realistic about what they can take on and fulfill the tasks accordingly.
Now that we understand how important the board's role is, how do we transfer that knowledge into action? Why are board members sometimes not as engaged in fundraising as we'd like them to be? So if you're here today, we can assume that you're interested in encouraging more involvement from your board. So let's look at some common reasons why board members are not as involved in fundraising as we'd like them to be. The first is lack of time. We have to recognize that our board members are volunteers, so inevitably, they're going to have other responsibilities, like a full-time job perhaps, family responsibilities, or even other volunteer commitments. Some volunteers have more time to give than others, which will of course impact how much time board members can contribute to their work on the board. Volunteers may be very passionate about their work, but when people aren't getting reimbursed, it's reasonable that they'll organize their time around various responsibilities. If you have board members with limited time, it's important to understand what they can realistically accomplish. The second reason they might not be involved is lack of experience. Being on a board can be a great way for some people to develop skills that they don't already have. And in fact, that can be what draws many people to volunteering for a board. People can also leverage board work to build their personal networks and build expertise in areas they're interested in. And many people will volunteer for a board to help them build their careers. On one hand, this variation in board members can be extremely beneficial for your organization, since it often leads to a board that has a diverse skill set. And while having different experiences on your board can be a strength, it can also cause an issue if board members don't have the skills or knowledge to contribute in the ways that you would like them to. So for example, if your board members lack fundraising skills, that can inhibit their ability to enhance the success of your organization's fundraising strategy. So this can certainly be a challenge when board members aren't equipped to help you in the ways you would like. When onboarding new board members, carry out a skills assessment to understand what strengths and weaknesses your board members may have. Now, the third reason is perhaps an opposite problem to having a board member that lacks experience, is having a board member who is an expert. And you may be thinking, how could that possibly be a problem? We'd all love to have experts on our boards. However, sometimes this can be a challenge when either intentionally or unintentionally, the board member comes off as arrogant or like they know everything. And sometimes these experts can be dismissive of opinions or ideas of others, which can cause an added challenge in terms of the relationships between board members, causing other board members to withdraw from being engaged because they don't feel their voice is being heard, or it can even challenge the relationship between board members and staff. Now, it should be noted that we will be discussing more about how to manage these interpersonal conflicts later in the presentation. The next reason they might not be involved are inactive members within the board. There have been organizations that we've spoken to that tell us they have board members who are nice people, they're personable, they show up for meetings, but really there are only 1 or 2 members that really help with the workload. Eventually the work may become unmanageable, and in the worst case scenario, the few people doing all of the work burn out and decide to step away from the organization altogether. Strong communication at board meetings can really help alleviate this challenge. Next is they're uncomfortable asking for money. As we previously discussed, For a lot of people, the word fundraising means asking for money. And for those of us who are parents or guardians and have had to sell chocolate bars to fundraise for your child's sports team or school, we all know how uncomfortable that feeling can be. This can be a challenge when your organization lacks capacity and relies on board members to contribute by asking for donations from the community. So for many board members, the idea of asking for money is just uncomfortable. And that's actually okay, because as we shared earlier, fundraising can be much more gentle than asking for money. So there is a role for board members who don't want to ask for donations, but still want to be involved in your organization's fundraising. And finally, there are people who are long-term members of your board and tied to past practices. Sometimes, when people have been on the board for a long time, they're not interested in doing things in a new way because they believe in the success of past activities. So if you've heard a volunteer say something like, "We have to do that event," or "We've always done it this way," that can often signal there may be some tension in developing a new approach. Now, we can say from experience that we've worked with organizations that have had this type of tension, but this is not always negative. For example, we worked with one of the original board members of an organization. And while they were hesitant to try new things, they were not only passionate about past practices, but also willing to lead them. And they actually had very valuable historical information about the organization in their head. In this case, the knowledge that they held was really important for this organization to draw on because they actually didn't have any documentation. So while it seemed perhaps that this person was a bit of a difficult board member, in fact, they were an asset to the organization, and they just needed to find an appropriate way to work within this volunteer's strengths. While it's not necessarily negative to have longtime board members, it can be an added challenge to the dynamic of your organization's board.
So perhaps you can relate to some of those common issues that organizations experience when hoping to get their board more involved in fundraising. But now the big question is, how do we solve these issues? What are some practical ways you can engage the board in fundraising so you can spread the work of fundraising across more people, work more effectively with the board, and avoid some of the frustration that comes along with wishing you could get more out of your board? So let's look at some strategies. And now first, we're going to start with some larger process type strategies your organization can work towards. And then we'll share some smaller kind of bite-sized strategies that are quicker to implement, including ones that you can start implementing right away. So the first large kind of foundational strategy to work towards is developing strong leadership. As you likely noticed, many of the common challenges with board members are actually interpersonal challenges that impact the effectiveness of the board's working relationships. A strong chairperson will help manage many of those interpersonal challenges by managing the discussion at the board table appropriately. And that can also be referred to as ensuring the meetings are in order. Now, that can be one of the most important and also most difficult jobs of the chairperson. For example, we talked about the challenges of having board members that are not open to the ideas of others. And a good chair will manage that challenge by inviting input from all board members during meetings and discussions. We really can't emphasize enough the importance of having a strong chair and also having a succession plan to ensure that future board chair people are equipped to take on that task. Another foundational strategy to consider implementing that can really support your chairperson's efforts to maintain productive meeting times is having guidelines for how the board will conduct itself. This will inform board members that your organization both values and prioritizes respectful communication at board meetings and in between board meetings with staff and volunteers. So either a working document or even a set of values on how members are expected to conduct themselves with each other or with staff can be really helpful because it makes it clear that people will work in a respectful manner, even when people agree. Rochelle and I have often spoken at conferences and other workshops about the benefits of organizations having diverse boards. And right now, we see a lot of organizations in the sector prioritizing diversifying their boards so that they have people with different and very beneficial perspectives. But with that added diversity can come conflict because diversity inherently involves different people having varying ideas on how things can get done or how they should get done. Therefore, having guidelines for board conduct can be really important. So if you don't have one, we really recommend you create one now. And if you're not sure where to start, we've actually created a template for you that you can use to inform your own guidelines or to start your own guidelines. So we'll be sharing a link to some of the resources we provided later on in the presentation. Another strategy to work towards is to start a culture of documentation for your organization. Now, documentation does not have to be difficult. All you really have to do is write down any problematic behavior that you experience at meetings. So for example, even if between a meeting, someone sends an email that's rude, do you have a place to store it? Or if something disrespectful happens at a meeting and you make a note of it, do you have somewhere to store it? So if you're not sure where to start with documentation, we've also created a resource, a template form that your organization can use. So again, we'll be sharing that resource closer to the end of the session. The reality is we're all people. We can all have our off days, or perhaps you could be having a discussion at the board meeting that is very sensitive to a certain member and you don't know why. So people will have moments when they're being difficult or challenging, but when your organization has a culture of documentation, then it becomes easy to see if something has become a consistent pattern and therefore a problem. So documentation allows you to look at the behavior objectively and to collect the experiences of various people. So for example, if one board member was disrespectful to several people on different occasions, when each of those situations are documented and put in the same place, you can see at a high level how the person's behavior may be impacting the work of the organization. And with the documentation, you can look back and say, okay, this person has been challenging or difficult on 3 separate occasions. And then you can look at your guidelines for board conduct and see if a follow-up is necessary, where the person perhaps needs to be reminded of the code of conduct or the set of values when it comes to behavior. Or you can decide whether the problem should be confronted in some other way. So that leads to another piece of advice that you could work towards implementing, which is having a process for confronting problematic behavior of board members. So nowadays, we're so lucky to have various ways to communicate with people, phone calls, virtual meetings like we're on right now, email. But when it comes to confronting difficult behavior, we recommend having a meeting in person if you can. Difficult conversations, in our opinion, are just better in person. It allows you to make eye contact, read body language, and communicate a different level of sincerity. You can also accomplish some of these things virtually, but meeting in person over a cup of coffee and explaining how a challenge is impacting the work of your organization tends to be better. So this is when the documentation comes in handy, because it will allow you to use specific examples of problematic behavior, which can really depersonalize the challenge. So instead of saying, you're difficult, you yell at people, it becomes, at this meeting on this date, the conversation became uncomfortable when you raised your voice at another board member, which is against our respectful communication policy. Or perhaps we've noticed you've not attended the last 3 meetings on these dates. Can you please confirm your commitment to attending board meetings? So the point of confrontation is to highlight the problematic behavior and how it is negatively impacting the work of the board. It is not to make it about the individual or anything personal. So now that we've looked at these sort of larger foundational strategies, let's discuss some smaller strategies that your organization can implement to encourage more active fundraising engagement from board members.
The first smaller strategy is targeted recruitment, which means to be clear right at the recruitment stage that you're seeking board members with fundraising expertise, or that your organization has an expectation that board members will be involved in fundraising. You can do this by including specific skills and responsibilities right in the job description. When you are specific in the job description, then volunteers will know what is expected of them, or perhaps they'll decline the opportunity to volunteer. But either way, it allows volunteers the opportunity to make a clear decision. Another strategy, which was just mentioned in the previous slide, is to have job descriptions. If your organization does not have job descriptions for your board members or other volunteers, there's no need to start from scratch. Towards the end of the presentation, we'll be providing a link in the chat with some sample job descriptions that you can download. The sample job description has fundraising qualifications that you can use to create or update your own board job descriptions. Having job descriptions are particularly helpful if you have board members that are inactive or not working as much as you would like. If you would like board members to fundraise, the job description should certainly reference fundraising. And even better, it should be specific about what activities board members are responsible for. For example, board members are expected to familiarize themselves with the organization's case for support, or board members are expected to attend fundraising events. The more you can list in terms of what you expect of board members, the better. It's also important to revisit the job descriptions annually to see if it's still meeting your organization's goals. Job descriptions not only make sure your organization has someone working on all the tasks needed, but it also makes it easier for volunteers to understand what is expected of them so they can do a good job. Ultimately, it helps volunteers feel supported and helps them do their best work. The next strategy is to seek training where necessary. If you have an enthusiastic board member that wants to contribute their skills, but needs more support due to a lack of experience in certain areas, professional development is a great option. For example, you can bring in a consultant to guide you through the process of creating a fundraising plan, or to provide some training for board members so they can be more effective. You can also seek out workshops and training opportunities that would be beneficial and ask board members if they would like to attend. Webinars like today's are free and simply require the time of your volunteers. Learning and development opportunities can be very helpful in retaining your volunteers as well, because people love to learn and enhance their skills. The next strategy is to be intentional about ongoing communication and involvement of your board in fundraising. Spend time at meetings updating the board on fundraising activities and discuss how they can be involved. Also, ask your board members how they would like to be involved. People are more likely to be engaged in activities that they like participating in. So rather than simply assigning board members specific activities, ask them where they'd like to help and delegate activities from there. Another strategy is leveraging technology so you can easily report to your board on your fundraising progress. Keeping your board informed with your fundraising progress to date or recent donations that were significant can keep people engaged and interested. If you're not an expert in summarizing data and creating reports, donor management software can help make that easier for staff and also help the board to be accountable in monitoring the progress towards your fundraising goals. Another thing to consider when you have a board member that may not be contributing in the way you would like is to listen. It can be difficult when you feel like someone is being challenging or not open to new ways of thinking or doing things, or when someone lacks the expertise to contribute in the ways you would like. You may want to confront them with the issues and get all of the problems off your chest. However, you have to be prepared to listen to them and see if they're experiencing challenges. Perhaps they're not contributing because they lack a good job description. Maybe something has changed in their personal life and their availability has changed, and that's why they're not attending meetings. Or perhaps they have a personal issue that needs to be addressed. There's always two sides to a story, so always approach challenges with an open mind and a willingness to listen. We spoke earlier about how there may be a need to confront difficult behavior, and we suggested confronting those issues. But even the word confrontation is uncomfortable, and most people don't love having uncomfortable conversations. So we encourage having a third neutral party present whenever there will be a difficult conversation with a board member. Don't have the conversation at a regular board meeting in front of a group. Arrange a smaller meeting with the board chair or whomever is in the lead, and have a third neutral person that you both feel comfortable with. Whenever two people have a conversation, it's likely that each person will leave the conversation with their own understanding of what happened in that meeting. A third person can be the mediator, listen to both sides, and document the outcomes of the meeting, specifically what the next steps will be. And our last smaller strategy is to create a committee. Some common names for the committee are a fundraising committee, a development committee, or a fund development committee. This can be a particularly great option if your board lacks experience in fundraising. While we recommend including your board chair and an additional board member to act as a liaison between the committee's work and the board, you can invite community members with additional expertise to join as well. There are many benefits of having a committee. It can help you create relationships with more volunteers who may also be good future board member candidates. Also, you can create meeting requirements that are less demanding, which may attract a broader group of people to help. In addition, it helps you lean on the expertise of a fresh group of people your board can rely on, and it can also increase your capacity by spreading the workload across more people. And finally, the committee can also help support and encourage the board in their fundraising efforts. For example, the committee can help develop a fundraising budget for board approval or make recommendations to the board about long-term funding plans.
So we've discussed the reasons why your board may not be involved as fundraising as much as you would like. provided a few strategies on how to support them. And one of the most important factors in engaging the board in fundraising is to make it easy for your board members to participate. Because as we discussed earlier, they're volunteers, and we want to help our board members and keep things organized for them so they can feel that they're making a valuable contribution. So we want to sort of end our set of recommendations by sharing some simple activities that you can implement right away that will encourage your board to participate in your organization's fundraising. So firstly, set a date for an annual fundraising planning day. When you want to collaborate on fundraising, you need a goal and a plan that you're working towards. As the board is ultimately responsible for your organization's sustainability, the board should convene at least once a year to set the goal and the strategy that should be implemented to achieve that goal. And as we shared earlier, when the board has input, what the board has input on, they'll be more likely to be involved and interested in. Secondly, ask your board members for their involvement. It might sound simple, but sometimes people do need to be asked before they can help out with something. So be thoughtful about where you need help in your fundraising strategy and ask board members to help with specific tasks. Next, an important one, share stories of people that have benefited from the work of your organization at board meetings. So share quotes, share testimonials, or even invite someone who's benefited from your organization's work to come in and speak to the board. Remind the board of the importance of the work you do and the value of your organization. When they go out and share those stories, that act in itself is contributing to your organization's fundraising efforts. And you make it for board members, you make it very easy for board members to share with a lot of pride when you make it a regular occurrence to share those stories. And finally, thank your board members. Thank them now and thank them again when they do something helpful. And let them know you need their help and that their work is valued. Our sector is facing a volunteer shortage, which really highlights the importance of keeping board members engaged and thanking them for their contributions. So as we mentioned earlier, hopefully, Mercedes, you can share the link. We've provided 3 resources to help your organization with engaging the board in fundraising. So as we shared, we created a sample board job description with fundraising qualifications. We've created a sample policy for respectful communication, and also a sample form to document any problematic behavior of any members. Feel free to download, edit, or use as is, or to enhance the policies that your organization is currently using. And on the topic of templates, if you are looking for additional templates to help your organization with your fundraising plan, we have several free resources on our website. If you head over to storypoint.ca and check our resource section, we've got some templates there. And we also have some more resources on our short stories blog. We have articles and podcast episodes with fundraising tips and advice. So we're going to just take a moment to pause and look at questions. I see there's quite a number of questions in the Q&A that we'll get to. If we run out of time and there's a question that you wanted to reach out to us directly for, this is where you can find us. We're on the web, LinkedIn, Facebook, and our email is there as well. So I'll just open up the Q&A and take a look and see if there's questions that we haven't perhaps gotten to.
Roxanne, do you want me to read them out and then we'll discuss? Or
why not?
So the first one from Susan is, how do we deal with the fact that potential donors are deluged by fundraising requests? How do we deal with donor fatigue that might result from that? Just as an individual, I feel fatigued by all the requests for donations I receive, and I'm assuming others may experience that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Donor fatigue is certainly an issue, and it's certainly important that you have a fundraising plan that takes into account how you're going to space out your requests to donors throughout the year. So that would be an important strategy to discuss at like a board planning session when you're kind of looking at the year ahead in the strategy. So that's a great activity to involve your board in. Kind of what's the communication plan for the year, and how do you want to approach those with your organization?
And also making sure that, you know, when you're contacting your donors, it's not always an ask. Again, that's another thing that the board can help with. There's many ways you can communicate with your donors, and it doesn't always have to be an ask. I'll get to the second question. What should be the size of a reserve as a proportion of the total budget?
Mm-hmm. So earlier we talked about a strategy for the board is to work towards setting aside a reserve fund as a possible strategy to help your organization in times of uncertainty. We all know we've all gone through a lot of uncertainty over the last several years. So that is a pretty personal to a specific organization. We wouldn't suggest a specific percentage. I think it's quite personal to your organization's circumstances and the programs you're offering. Usually, probably a good place to start is trying to figure out about your kind of more priority resources, whether that be priority staff. You would make sure you need to be able to continue with their salary and benefits, or whether it be priority programs that you would have to keep going in times of uncertainty. And that's also probably a good conversation to have with your funders. But first, sitting down and figuring out what would be the priority needs if something were to happen and you needed to rely on a reserve.
Okay. The next question is, you mentioned it was helpful to have a fundraising budget. With so many of us heavily program project funded, how would you suggest starting to build this line item?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It brings up another topic which Rochelle and I are pretty passionate about, which is obviously the need for more operational funding. But that's a whole nother webinar. Yeah, so I know it is not unusual for organizations to be funded by a program or by a project. But this is why it's important for your board to kind of have a strategy to start to develop a fundraising plan aside from any funding specific to a project. So for example, if there is a community foundation you're applying to annually to support your project funding, that would be a good activity for your board to figure out how can we create a budget for fundraising resources. Sometimes if I say with community foundations, they will help you with sort of a part-time or a term budget to sort of get a fundraising plan started, which can help you to sort of start to build that line item of having a fundraising budget moving forward. So it's a good thing to discuss with your funders, but certainly a good thing to discuss at the board table about strategizing on how to create that budget for fundraising.
The next question, lots of boards now meet virtually. Are there guidelines for board conduct specific to virtual meetings?
That's a great question, actually. What I would suggest is, like we included our resource today with guidelines for respectful conduct. And I don't know that we have anything in there specific to virtual meetings, but it's certainly a great idea to include some values that you might have in regards to how you're going to conduct yourself with virtual meetings. There's usually no need to start from scratch. There's usually examples out there on the internet to look for. But that's certainly a great point. I think we would suggest, if you're meeting mostly virtually or virtually all the time, to certainly think about updating your guidelines on your policies to just include the way you'd like to do business and your values for how you're going to communicate respectfully online.
Okay, this one from Nicole. What do you propose if the the way it used to be
Yeah.
person is the
Yeah.
board chair, making resistance radiate throughout the organization?
Thanks for that question, Nicole. It's certainly a challenge, and I know that you're probably not the only person in the room or who will listen to the webinar that has had that challenge, where the board chair is maybe the one that's kind of pushing or giving you that resistance to trying new ways of doing things. So in that case, if you have another person on the board who is contributing well, whether you have a vice chair or someone who's next in line, trying to work with that person, or even seeing if that person is willing to sort of take the lead on those things that used to be the way they are, and that if there's somebody else on the board who's willing to take the lead on a new initiative. And then you can sit and compare and contrast and see which one worked better in a respectful way. So hopefully you have someone else that's strong on your board who's willing to kind of take the lead on something new, or focus on prioritizing a strong successor who's willing to look at something new. And we don't necessarily recommend pushing back on that person and saying we're cutting it, unless it's something that is really not working for your organization. But if they're insistent on it, then see if they're willing to take the lead.
And there was also another question from Lynn: what if the chair is challenging? So I hope that answers both of them. It's a similar question. Another question from Lynn: would it be the chair who follows up with the person whose behavior is challenging, or a couple of board members?
Great question, Lynn. Usually the chair is a good person, but I think within your organization, it's best to look at who's the best person in those situations, because not everybody enjoys, not that there's really anybody, who knows it. Maybe you're lucky and you've got someone on your board who loves confrontation and loves difficult discussions, but who's the best at it? Who's the best at it in that scenario? So it's normally the board chair. If the board chair isn't that strong in having those uncomfortable conversations, and have the board chair and someone who's good at it, or the neutral party that's there to sort of help with that conversation. But like I said, normally, but it doesn't have to be. Whoever's best in those scenarios is always the best option.
Okay, the next one from Sarah: is there a difference in approaching fundraising with an operational board versus a strategic board?
Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming what you mean by that is the board who's kind of the working board and kind of more involved in the day-to-day, versus the board who is looking more at a high level at how your organization is running. So the difference might be that if you have that kind of, for example, if you're an organization that's volunteer run, or you have maybe one executive director or one staff, you're probably going to be a working board, and you're probably going to need more of a more hands-on effort from your board members. And if you have more of this strategic board that's able to sort of be looking at a bird's eye view, they're still going to be heavily involved. But the focus of your strategic board, if you have the capacity within staff or other volunteers to do the hands-on work, they should still be focused mostly on the future and how are we continuing to sustain the financial health of the organization. If you don't have that capacity and you need a working board, then the board will still be looking into the future, but they're going to have to provide more of the hands-on support in the implementation of the fundraising strategy throughout the year. So it's really going to depend on the needs of your organization and the capacity that you have to do the day-to-day work.
Okay, our next one from Nicole: what is your recommendation when the board does not have experienced fundraising personnel, but they still try to dictate the fundraising strategy?
Yes. Nicole, I'm sure you're not alone in that. I think that we've worked with organizations who've said something like this. Our board isn't necessarily helpful in the fundraising, but they'll come and say like, oh, this grant is up, you should apply for that, or we should do this, we should do this event, that organization did this event and it was great, and we should do this. So a lot of that tends to be controlled when you have a fundraising plan. And so if you can get your board involved in the annual plan and what strategies you're going to implement throughout the year, then if you had someone who came to you and said, we should do this off the cuff thing, you'll say, that's a great idea. It's not on this year's plan. So let's think about adding that to next year's plan. So really kind of mapping out what's going to happen this year and what do we have the capacity to do is pretty helpful in managing those expectations.
Okay, the next one from Karen. What is the best strategy? Board members talking to other board members about fundraising duties, or should the ED CEO have one of those one-on-one conversations with each board member if they are disengaged?
Thanks, Karen, for the question. So if you yourself or you have an organization who has an ED or CEO, they should be involved in all of those conversations, because they're going to be responsible for operationing. That's not the word. Making it operational. Whatever the board has strategized, the ED is going to be paramount in making that operational and helping ensure the organization has the capacity to see out the plan. So board members can talk amongst themselves, but at some point somebody should be involving the ED and CEO. If there's a difficult conversation that needs to be had there because someone's disengaged, I would suggest that the ED and the chair would probably be the best to be involved in that conversation.
Mercedes, do we have time for one more, or should we wrap up and we answer the remainder after?
Please feel free to answer just one or two more, whatever works best for you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll get a couple more then from Sylvia. How much say can the ED have in who becomes a board member? I was once told that as an ED, I should be sure to be actively involved in recruiting and choosing board members to ensure that they could do the best, or that you can do your best work.
So normally that will really vary from organization to organization, depending on your capacity as an ED and how full your plate is. So if your organization has a nominating committee that's kind of responsible for board recruitment, the ED should be involved on that committee and providing some suggestions, but it is generally the responsibility of that committee. If you don't have a nominating committee or some type of committee or working group that's responsible for recruiting board members, then I would suggest that's something that your organization try to work towards implementing. But it's certainly important, I think, to have an ED's, your perspective as an ED on what skills are needed and who might be great to fill those skills. Because if you're working with other volunteers in any kind of capacity, you've got a perspective the other board members don't in identifying people. That being said, it doesn't mean it's your job alone. The board should be helping to identify people as well.
Okay, I think we're running short on time here, so we might want to wrap up. We'll have to, there's still 14 questions.
There's a few questions, but as you know, our email is up, and I think Mercedes is also going to share, remind you where you could send your questions if you have some further questions.
Yes, exactly. So thank you so much for such a great presentation. And as we are closing on the hour mark, like you said, do you happen to have any final comments before we sign off today for all of the attendees?
You know, Rochelle and I just love to end with like a word of encouragement, because, you know, this topic, and I'm not sure if there's board members on the call. It's great if your board members are attending today, and it shows that they are committed. And we find that this topic can be one that's quite frustrating and difficult for people to deal with. But you're not alone, and there are strategies that can help kind of improve your working relationship with the board. So we just wish you all luck and hope that some of the strategies we shared today can be helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Rochelle and Roxanne. I just wanted to remind everyone that you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the webinar recording. So please feel free to share this link with your colleagues. The email will also include a survey link that you can fill out with your feedback on today's webinar. You should see a survey link pop up right here in Zoom following the session as well. On behalf of Charity Village, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for our next free webinar, How to Turn Event Attendees into Long-Term Donors. You can find more information on this and all of our upcoming webinars at charityvillage.com/webinars. Thanks again for taking part in today's webinar. I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day.